Wyoming Territory, 1885. The silence was the first thing a man noticed, and the last thing he ever forgot. It was a living entity, woven from the vastness of the sky and the endless roll of the sage-dusted plains. It pressed down in the heat of noon and whispered on the edge of the wind that scoured the high country. Caleb Blackwood had come to know this silence as his only true companion. It asked for nothing and took nothing, a state of grace he had not found among men. He stood on the rise, overlooking his modest ranch, the weathered timbers of the house and barn a small, defiant anchor in the immensity of the landscape. His hands, calloused and competent, worked a length of supple leather, mending a broken rein with the practiced, unconscious rhythm of a man who lived by the labor of his hands. The scent of pine from the distant Bighorn Mountains mingled with the dry, clean smell of dust and sun-baked earth. This was his world, ordered and contained. He had built it piece by piece from the ashes of another life, a life he kept locked away in a part of his mind he never visited. A flicker of movement on the horizon drew his eye, not the lazy circling of a hawk or the distant shimmer of antelope, but a deliberate plume of dark smoke, staining the perfect, pale blue of the sky. The train. It was a twice-weekly intrusion, a noisy, smoke-belching serpent of iron that linked this isolated corner of the world to the one he had left behind. It brought mail, supplies, and occasionally new faces that rarely stayed long. The land was a harsh filter, sifting out the weak, the unprepared, and the unlucky. Caleb felt a familiar tightening in his chest, a low thrum of irritation. The train was a reminder of noise, of complication, of people. He had come here seeking the opposite. After the war, after the clatter and chaos and the screams, silence had been a balm. After Mary and little Samuel were taken by the fever, silence had become a necessity, a fortress wall against the echoes of laughter and lullabies that could still ambush him in the dead of night. He believed, with the conviction of a man who had lost everything, that attachments were a vulnerability, a crack in the armor that life would inevitably exploit. A man survived alone. It was the only law he trusted. He finished his work on the rein, the stitching even and strong. He needed salt and flour from the general store in Redemption, a task he'd been putting off. The arrival of the train meant the store would be crowded, the air thick with gossip and the stale smell of sweat and cheap perfume. He sighed, the sound lost in the vastness. It cannot be helped. He slung the rein over his shoulder, his movements economical and sure, and walked toward the barn where his horse, Apollo, waited patiently. The train whistle, a lonely, mournful cry, drifted across the miles, and for a reason he could not name, it sounded less like an arrival and more like a warning. Eleanora Vance stepped down from the stifling heat of the passenger car, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The platform was rough-hewn planking, the air not filled with the familiar coal smoke and city clamor of Philadelphia, but with a fine, gritty dust that settled instantly on her dark green traveling suit and clung to the damp skin at her temples. The sun was a physical weight, immense and white-hot in a sky of impossible size and clarity. Everything was brown and gold and muted green, a stark and brutal palette that made the memory of her green, ordered world seem like a dream. She clutched her ticket, the paper limp in her gloved hand, and scanned the handful of faces on the platform. Weather-beaten men in dusty hats, their gazes lingering on her with an open, unnerving curiosity. A few women in faded calico dresses, their expressions a mixture of weariness and appraisal. There was no sign of a well-dressed gentleman. No one who looked like the Mr. Silas Croft whose elegantly worded letter promised a life of quiet companionship for his ailing wife in a comfortable, modern home. The letter had felt like a lifeline, a respectable escape from the lonely future of a penniless, orphan governess. Her trunk was unceremoniously dumped onto the platform with a thud that seemed to echo her sinking heart. She approached the station master, a harried man with a sweat-stained collar and a pencil tucked behind his ear. "Excuse me, sir," she began, her voice sounding unnaturally formal in the lazy afternoon heat. "I'm looking for Mr. Silas Croft." I was given to understand he would be here to meet me. The station master stopped his checking of a manifest and looked at her, his gaze taking in her fine clothes and the expensive leather of her trunk. A flicker of something, pity perhaps, crossed his face. Silas Croft? Ma'am, the Croft place is a good 2 hours' ride from here, and he ain't a man for meeting trains. Not unless there's money on it. He gestured vaguely toward the vast, empty plains to the west. His spread is out that way, controls most of the water in the valley, or tries to a cold dread, stark and unwelcome, began to seep into the edges of her weary hope. But his letter, he wrote that his wife required a companion. The man gave a short, harsh laugh. His wife? Ma'am, Abigail Croft passed on near 3 years ago. It's just him and his boy Jed out there now, and neither of them are fit company for a lady like you. The implication hung in the dusty air, heavy and suffocating. The letter was a lie. The entire premise of her journey, the foundation of her desperate hope, was a fabrication. She was alone, thousands of miles from anything she knew, stranded in a town called Redemption that suddenly felt like the very opposite. Panic, sharp and metallic, rose in her throat. She fought it down, her breeding and her innate sense of pride refusing to allow her to crumble in front of these strangers. She had to think. There must be a hotel, a respectable place where she could stay until she figured out what to do. As she turned, trying to gather her wits and her composure, her heel caught on an uneven plank. She gasped, her balance lost, her arms flailing as she stumbled backward, directly into the path of a man exiting the mercantile. A solid wall of muscle and worn denim met her. Strong hands gripped her upper arms, steadying her with a surprising lack of force. She found herself pressed for a brief, shocking moment against a hard chest, her face just inches from a lean, sun-bronzed jaw shadowed with stubble. Her senses were flooded. The scent of leather, clean sweat, and something wild and elemental like the pine-scented wind itself. He was tall, his presence radiating a quiet, formidable stillness. He set her back on her feet, his touch lingering no longer than necessary, yet the imprint of his hand seemed to burn through the fabric of her dress. "Careful there, ma'am," he said. His voice was a low baritone, rough-edged, but not unkind. It held the same resonant quiet as the landscape around them. Eleonora's heart was hammering against her ribs, a chaotic rhythm of fear, embarrassment, and an entirely unexpected jolt of awareness. She looked up, truly seeing him for the first time. His eyes were the color of slate, shadowed beneath the brim of a dusty hat. They were watchful, intelligent, and held a profound weariness that seemed at odds with the raw strength of his frame. He was not looking at her with the leering curiosity of the other men. He was simply looking, assessing, acknowledging. "Thank you," she managed, her voice a whisper. I am clumsy." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, his gaze flicking from her face to her stranded trunk and back again. He saw the whole picture in a single, sweeping glance. The fine clothes, the expensive luggage, the lost expression. He saw a problem he wanted no part of. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of polite dismissal. "Ma'am." Then he turned and walked away, his long, sure strides eating up the dusty ground, leaving her standing there with the ghost of his touch on her arms and the unsettling feeling that she had just collided with the very soul of this harsh, unforgiving land. The encounter left him unsettled, a disruption in the carefully maintained quiet of his day. The scent of her, something like lavender, was a ghost in the air, a fragrance of a world he had purposefully abandoned. It was the scent of softness, of civilization, of complications. He loaded his supplies into his saddlebags, his movements terse and efficient, trying to push the image of her wide, frightened blue eyes from his mind. Eleonora, meanwhile, felt the stares of the townspeople like a physical touch. Her momentary interaction with a stranger had only intensified their interest. She felt exposed, a brightly colored bird with a broken wing, surrounded by curious predators. She secured the help of a young boy to move her trunk to the town's only hotel, a grim, two-story wooden structure that sat above the saloon. The sounds of raucous laughter and the tinny plink of a piano drifted up through the floorboards of the small, stuffy room she was given. The lock on the door was flimsy. The window looked out over a muddy alley. This was not a haven. It was a holding pen. Her composure finally cracked. She sank onto the lumpy mattress, the carefully constructed dam of her resilience breaking, and silent, hot tears of frustration and fear traced paths through the dust on her cheeks. The elegant letter was a cruel trick. She had spent the last of her inheritance on the train ticket. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. Down the street, Caleb found himself in the sheriff's office, a place he avoided unless necessary. Sheriff Brody was an older man, his face a roadmap of long years under the Wyoming sun. He and Caleb shared a quiet, unspoken respect forged from a few past troubles with rustlers. "Saw you in town, Caleb," Brody said, leaning back in his chair, which groaned in protest. "Figured the train must have brought something interesting." He gestured with his chin toward the street. "That new lady, the one from the east. Seems her welcome party forgot to show," Caleb grunted, feigning disinterest. "Not my concern, maybe not," Brody agreed, his eyes shrewd. "But it's become my concern. Station master says she was supposed to be met by Silas Croft. Said she was hired as a companion for his wife." Caleb's head came up. His slate-gray eyes narrowed. "Abigail's been dead for years. My point exactly," the sheriff said heavily. "Silas is a snake, and whatever game he's playing, that young woman is the bait. She can't stay at the saloon. It ain't safe, and there's not another respectable roof in this town that would take her." He let the silence stretch, then looked directly at Caleb. "Except maybe yours. You got the room. And you got Martha." Caleb felt a surge of pure, hot refusal. His home was his sanctuary, the one place inviolate from the outside world. The idea of bringing a stranger, a woman, a symbol of everything he had lost and now feared, into that space was abhorrent. "No," he said, the word flat and final. "Absolutely not, Caleb." Brody's voice was gentle but firm. "I ain't asking you to marry her. I'm asking you to be a decent man. She's alone and a long way from home. Croft lured her out here for a reason, and I guarantee it ain't a good one. Give her a few days, a week at most. Time for me to send a wire, figure out what's going on. It's the right thing to do." Caleb's jaw was a hard line. The right thing to do had cost him everything once before. Duty, honor, love, they were just pretty words for the chains that bound you to sorrow. He thought of her face, though, the flash of terror in her eyes when she stumbled. He remembered the feel of her, so fragile beneath his hands. It was a fragility that belied a spine of steel. He had seen it in the way she'd pulled herself together after their collision. Against every instinct, against every rule he had set for his solitary life, a grudging sense of responsibility stirred. It was an old, familiar feeling, and he hated it. He stared out the window, at the dust swirling in the street like golden phantoms. He thought of his quiet house, of the empty room across the hall from his own. The silence he cherished would be broken. "Martha won't like it," he said, the words a last, weak bastion of his resistance. Sheriff Brody smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "Martha will complain for an hour, and then she'll mother the girl to death. You know she will." Caleb let out a long, defeated breath. He was trapped by another man's treachery and his own buried decency. "A few days," he said, his voice raw. "And then she's your problem, Brody." The ride out to the ranch was a study in tense silence. Eleonora sat stiffly on the wagon seat beside Caleb, her hands clenched in her lap. The sheer, untamed wildness of the country was overwhelming. The sky was a vast, aching void, and the land rolled on forever, empty and intimidating. Caleb handled the team with an easy, silent competence, his attention fixed on the trail ahead. He had not offered a single word of comfort or explanation, only a terse instruction to gather her things. She felt like a parcel delivered to an unwilling recipient. When they arrived, the ranch was both smaller and more beautiful than she could have imagined. The house was built of sturdy, axe-hewn logs, with a wide porch and glass windows that glittered in the late afternoon sun. A stone chimney promised warmth. Surrounding it was an air of profound peace, a stark contrast to the barely contained chaos of the town. A woman with graying hair pulled into a severe bun and an apron tied crisply around her waist came out onto the porch, wiping her hands. Her expression was formidable. This, Eleonora presumed, was Martha. Caleb spoke before the woman could. "Martha, this is Miss Eleanora Vance. She'll be staying with us for a few days." Sheriff's request. The words were clipped, an order, not a discussion. Martha's gaze swept over Eleonora, sharp and appraising. It was the look of a woman who missed nothing. Eleonora felt herself flush under the scrutiny. "A few days," Martha repeated, her voice dry as dust. "And where, exactly, are we to put her?" "The spare room," Caleb said, already unhitching the team, his back to them both. "See to it." Eleonora's stomach twisted. She was an intrusion, a disruption. She opened her mouth to protest, to say that she couldn't possibly impose. But Martha spoke first, her tone softening almost imperceptibly as she looked at Eleonora's pale, exhausted face. "Well, you're here now. No sense standing in the sun. Come inside, child. You look like you're about to collapse." The gruffness was a thin veneer over a deep well of practicality, and for the first time in hours, Eleonora felt a flicker of something other than fear. Dinner that evening was an excruciating affair. The three of them sat at a heavy pine table in a kitchen that was warm and smelled of roasting chicken and freshly baked bread. The food was simple and delicious, but the silence was a fourth presence at the table. Caleb ate with a grim focus, his eyes on his plate. Martha, having fussed over Eleonora and shown her to a small but spotlessly clean room, now seemed to be observing the two of them, her expression unreadable. Eleonora knew she had to break the tension. It was a social obligation, a habit ingrained from years of navigating polite society. "Your ranch is very peaceful, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice quiet. Caleb looked up, seeming surprised that she had spoken. The conversation died. She tried again, desperation lending her courage. "The bread is wonderful, Martha. I haven't tasted anything so good in a long time." A flicker of a smile touched Martha's lips. "Simple country fare. Nothing like what you're used to." "I'm sure it's better," Eleonora said, and she meant it. The honesty of the food, of the solid wood table, of the quiet labor that had produced it all, was a comfort. "In Philadelphia, everything is bought. Nothing feels real." She looked at Caleb, seeking some kind of connection. "You built this all yourself?" He met her gaze, and for a moment, the guard in his eyes lowered. "Most of it, it's a fine home," she said softly. The simple compliment seemed to hang in the air. He looked away, back to his plate, but not before she saw a shadow of profound pain cross his features. She had touched a nerve, trespassed on some private grief. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Later, as Martha cleared the table, Caleb remained, staring into the depths of his coffee cup. Eleonora knew she should retire, leave him to his solitude, but she couldn't. She felt a need to explain herself, to justify her unwanted presence in his home. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I want you to know how sorry I am for this intrusion. The letter, it was all a falsehood. My parents passed away last winter. I had no family left and very few prospects. The position as a companion seemed like a godsend. I never would have come if I had known." He listened without looking at her, his posture rigid. When she finished, he was silent for a long time. The only sound was the crackle of the fire in the hearth. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough, stripped of its earlier defensiveness. "Loss makes people do desperate things." The simple, stark empathy in his words undid her. She had expected dismissal, or perhaps pity. She had not expected understanding. "Yes," she whispered. He finally lifted his head, and his slate eyes met hers across the table. The weariness in them was a vast, empty landscape, much like the one outside. "I had a wife," he said, the words costing him more than she could ever know. "And a son. The fever took them both. 5 years ago, he offered no more details. He didn't need to. The chasm of his grief was suddenly laid bare between them. It was a raw, unadorned truth, a shared vulnerability that connected them more profoundly than any polite conversation could. He was not just a grim, silent rancher. He was a man hollowed out by sorrow, just as she was. In his fortress of solitude, he had made a space, however small, to acknowledge hers. "I am so sorry," she said, her own loss a fresh ache in her chest. He gave a single, sharp nod, a gesture that both acknowledged her sympathy and closed the subject. He stood, his chair scraping against the floorboards. "Martha will show you what needs doing. You'll earn your keep while you're here." It was a return to his gruff practicality, a retreat to safe ground, but the wall between them was no longer quite so high or so solid. A crack had appeared, and in that small opening, a fragile, tentative respect had begun to take root. The days that followed fell into a strange, quiet rhythm. Eleonora, true to Caleb's word, was expected to earn her keep. She shed her fine traveling suit for a simple calico dress borrowed from Martha's trunk. At first, she was clumsy, her soft hands unaccustomed to the work. She fumbled with mending, her stitches uneven next to Martha's neat rows. She burned the first batch of biscuits she tried to make, but she did not complain. She watched, she learned, and she persisted. She found a quiet satisfaction in the work. Tending the small vegetable garden, her fingers in the cool, dark earth felt more honest than any drawing room conversation she had ever endured. Kneading dough, feeling it come to life beneath her hands, was a tangible act of creation. Martha, her initial skepticism slowly melting away, became a grudging teacher, her sharp instructions laced with an undercurrent of approval. "Put your back into it, girl. That floor won't scrub itself." But later, a cup of tea would appear at Eleanor's elbow. Caleb watched her from a distance. He would see her in the garden, a stray wisp of her honey-blonde hair escaping her braid to catch the sunlight, her face smudged with dirt and earnest with concentration. He saw her talking with Martha on the porch, her laughter sounds so foreign in his silent house that it almost hurt to hear. He had expected a delicate, useless creature who would wilt under the first hardship. Instead, he saw a resilience that mirrored the tough, slender wildflowers that grew in the cracks of the rocks. She was not fragile. She was strong in a way he had not anticipated, a quiet, enduring strength that was different from his own, but no less formidable. He maintained his distance, his conversations with her limited to terse pleasantries. But he found his eyes drawn to her constantly. He noticed the way the setting sun turned her hair to molten gold, the intelligence in her clear blue eyes when she read from the single volume of Shakespeare she had brought with her, the determined set of her jaw when she mastered a new task. She was a splash of vibrant color in his monochrome world, and it both terrified and fascinated him. Eleonora, in turn, began to see past Caleb's forbidding exterior. She saw the gentleness with which he treated his horse, the way his hands, so rough and calloused, could be incredibly careful when repairing a broken chair leg. She heard him, late at night, moving restlessly in his room across the hall, and knew his grief was a constant, sleepless companion. He was a man of deep currents, his silence not one of emptiness, but of depth. He was honorable, offering her his protection even when it went against his every instinct. A grudging admiration grew into something warmer, something that made her heart beat a little faster when he entered a room. The fragile peace of this new routine was shattered a week after her arrival. Two men rode up to the ranch. They were not cowboys or neighboring ranchers. They were rough, unkempt, and carried their guns with a casual menace. Caleb met them on the porch, positioning himself squarely in the doorway, a silent barrier. Eleonora and Martha watched from the kitchen window, their hands still. "We're looking for a woman," the taller one said, his eyes scanning past Caleb toward the house. "An Easterner. Came in on the train last week." "We hear she's here. You hear wrong," Caleb said, his voice flat and cold as river stone. "Now see, our boss, Mr. Croft, he says different," the other man sneered. "He sent for her. She's promised to his boy, Jed. He's getting impatient. Just send her on out, and we'll be on our way, promised." The word was ugly, proprietary. Eleonora felt a wave of nausea. This was the reality of Silas Croft's invitation. She was not to be a companion. She was to be a broodmare for his brutish son. Caleb didn't move. His hand rested loosely near the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. "The lady is under my protection," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous pitch. "The only way you're taking her is over my dead body. Now get off my land." The men exchanged a look. They saw the unyielding line of Caleb's shoulders, the absolute lack of fear in his eyes. They were bullies, not killers, at least not when the odds were even. They muttered a few curses, wheeled their horses around, and rode off, kicking up dust in their wake. But the threat they left behind was as tangible as a coiled snake. Caleb turned and came back inside, his face a grim mask. "Martha, keep the rifle handy. Eleonora, you don't leave the house. Not for any reason. Understand?" "Yes," she whispered, her heart pounding. The danger she had only imagined was now real, and it had a face. And Caleb, the man who wanted nothing to do with her, had just placed himself squarely between her and it. The tension on the ranch became a palpable thing. Caleb was a restless shadow, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, his rifle never far from his hand. He worked close to the house, his usual solitary patrols of his fence lines abandoned. The silence he had once cherished was now fraught with menace. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Eleonora felt like a caged bird. The house, once a sanctuary, was now a prison, however safe. The weight of her presence, the danger she had brought to this quiet place, was a heavy burden. She saw the strain in Caleb's face, the deep lines of worry around his eyes. He was protecting her, and she hated that it was necessary. A few days later, the oppressive stillness of the afternoon was shattered. Eleonora, needing a moment of air, had stepped onto the back porch, which was shielded from the main road. She was watching the small herd of horses Caleb kept in the near pasture. They were beautiful, powerful animals, and she often found a strange comfort in their simple existence. Suddenly, from the cover of a rocky outcrop some distance away, 2 gunshots cracked the air, not aimed at the house, but the ground near the horses. The herd, placid moments before, exploded into a panic. They scattered, eyes wide with terror, and began to stampede, their path taking them directly toward the creek and the low-lying area where a section of fence had been washed out in the spring rains. Eleonora stood frozen on the porch, her hand flying to her mouth. It was a deliberate, malicious act. Caleb burst out of the barn, his face a thundercloud. He had seen it all. He took in the stampeding horses, the direction of their flight, and Eleonora's position on the porch in a single, lightning-fast assessment. He didn't shout or hesitate. He launched himself into the saddle of Apollo, who was still tacked from an earlier task. He urged the powerful stallion into a flat-out gallop, not away from the stampede, but on an intercept course. Eleonora watched, her heart in her throat, as he became a blur of motion, a centaur of man and horse fused by desperation and skill. He rode like a demon, his body low over Apollo's neck, the wind tearing at his hat. He was not trying to stop the herd. He was trying to outrun it. She didn't understand his aim until he was almost upon her. He wasn't heading for the horses. He was heading for her. The ground was beginning to tremble from the approaching hoofbeats. "Get inside," he roared, his voice barely audible over the thunder. But her feet were rooted to the spot, her mind paralyzed by the terrifying spectacle. The lead stallion of the panic herd was almost to the creek bed. Caleb didn't slow down. As he drew level with the porch, he leaned far out of the saddle, his arm outstretched. "Jump," he commanded. For a split second, she hesitated, her mind unable to process the insane command. Then she saw the absolute certainty in his eyes, the raw, desperate urgency. She trusted that look. Gathering her skirts, she took a leap of pure faith, off the edge of the porch and into the air. His arm clamped around her waist like a band of iron. He hauled her from her feet with a grunt of effort, swinging her across the front of his saddle in a dizzying, terrifying arc. She landed hard against him, the air knocked from her lungs, her arms instinctively wrapping around his neck. His body was a wall of solid heat and muscle, shielding her. Apollo never broke stride. They cleared the corner of the house just as the first of the stampeding horses thundered past the spot where she had been standing, their eyes wild, their hooves churning the earth to a frenzy of dust and torn grass. Caleb reined Apollo in, circling the stallion back as the last of the herd galloped away into the open plain. The world came to a stop. The thunder of hooves receded, replaced by the ragged sound of their own breathing and the heaving of the horse beneath them. Eleonora was still pressed tight against Caleb, her face buried in the rough fabric of his shirt. She could feel the frantic, powerful beat of his heart against her cheek, or perhaps it was her own. She was trembling uncontrollably, the adrenaline a sickening, electric current in her veins. He held her for a long moment, his arm a possessive, protective weight around her. His other hand stroked Apollo's neck, calming the trembling animal. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice a low, rough rasp in her ear. She shook her head, unable to speak, her throat tight with unshed tears of terror and relief. She was safe. He had saved her. She had been standing on the edge of a violent, trampling death, and he had plucked her from it as if she weighed nothing. He slowly loosened his grip, allowing her to right herself in the saddle. She was effectively in his lap, her skirts tangled, her hair falling from its pins. The intimacy of their position was suddenly, starkly apparent. His scent enveloped her, leather, horse, and the clean, masculine scent of the man himself. His face was just inches from hers, his slate eyes dark with the aftermath of adrenaline and a deeper, more complicated emotion she couldn't name. It was fierce, protective, and utterly consuming. He had seen her on that porch, a fragile figure against a backdrop of chaos, and the thought of her being harmed, of her being lost, had struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was a terrifying echo of a past he could not escape. The fear he felt was not for his horses or his property. It was for her, and that realization shook him to his very core. He had just risked his life for the woman he had sworn to keep at a distance, and the relief that flooded him now that she was safe was so potent it was sickening. It felt dangerously like love. The aftermath of the rescue hung in the air between them, a charged and unspoken thing. The near disaster had stripped away all pretense, leaving only the raw truth of the danger they were in and the undeniable connection that was growing between them. Caleb, shaken by the depth of his own fear for Eleonora's safety, retreated once more behind his wall of silence. But it was a brittle, fractured defense. The terror of almost losing her had reawakened the ghost of his past trauma, and his only known response was to push away the source of that feeling. That evening, he found her on the porch, staring out at the landscape now bathed in the soft, melancholic light of dusk. He stood at the far end, his shoulders rigid. "You can't stay here," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. Eleonora turned, her heart sinking at his tone. She had been reliving the moment he had swept her into his arms, the feeling of his heart beating against hers. She had mistaken the fierce possessiveness in his eyes for something tender. Now, he looked at her as if she were a stranger, a problem to be disposed of. "What do you mean?" "Croft won't stop," he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Today was a warning. Next time, they won't be aiming for the ground. As long as you are here, this ranch is a target. You're a target. It's not safe, so we will be careful, she argued, stepping toward him. "I will not be a coward and run. This isn't about courage," he snapped, finally turning to face her. His eyes were cold, shuttered. "This is about survival. I won't have your death on my conscience. I'm taking you to Cheyenne at first light. There's a stagecoach from there that can take you east, back where you belong, back where you belong." The words were like a slap. After everything, after the tentative bonds they had formed, after she had begun to feel that perhaps, just perhaps, she could belong here, he was casting her out. She felt a surge of anger, hot and sharp, cutting through her hurt. "And what if I don't want to go? What if this is where I choose to be?" "You don't have a choice," he said, his voice hard as iron. "I'm taking you. This is my home, and I will not see it become a battlefield because of you." The cruelty of his words stole her breath. He saw her only as a liability, a catalyst for violence. The shared moments, the quiet understanding, the searing intimacy of the rescue, it had meant nothing to him. It was a misunderstanding of the highest order. She had allowed herself to hope, to feel, and he was crushing it beneath the heel of his cold practicality. "I see," she said, her voice trembling with the effort of keeping it steady. "I'm a burden. I apologize for misinterpreting your hospitality." She turned and walked back into the house, her back ramrod straight, refusing to let him see the tears that were already blurring her vision. Caleb watched her go, a hollow ache in his chest. Every word had been a lie, a necessary cruelty. He was sending her away not because she was a burden, but because the thought of her being harmed was a horror he could not bear. He was protecting himself from the agony of another loss. He was a coward, pushing away the first ray of light to enter his life in 5 years because he was terrified of the darkness that would follow if it were extinguished. He had to get her to safety, even if it meant destroying any chance of happiness for himself. The night was unnaturally still. A sliver of moon offered little light, leaving the ranch shrouded in deep, impenetrable shadows. Inside the house, an oppressive silence reigned. He was waiting for the dawn, which promised a painful but necessary farewell. The first sound was not the gallop of horses, but the soft, stealthy creak of a floorboard on the porch. Caleb was on his feet in an instant, his body taut with adrenaline. It wasn't a frontal assault. They were being clever. He moved silently to his door, cracking it open. He heard another sound, a faint scraping from the back of the house. They were surrounding them. He crossed the hall in 2 strides, pushing open Eleonora's door. She was already sitting up, her eyes wide with fear in the gloom. "Stay here," he whispered, his voice urgent. "And stay down, away from the windows." Before she could respond, the night exploded. A window in the main room shattered, and the roar of a shotgun blast echoed through the house, peppering the far wall with buckshot. It was followed by the crash of the front door being kicked in. The attack had begun. Caleb shoved Eleonora back toward the bed. "Down," he commanded, then spun and moved into the hallway, leveling his rifle. He saw 2 shapes silhouetted in the broken doorway. He fired, the report of the Winchester deafening in the enclosed space. One of the figures cried out and fell backward onto the porch. The other scrambled for cover. From the back of the house, another window broke. They were coming from 2 sides. "Caleb!" Martha screamed from her room down the hall. "Stay put, Martha!" he yelled, his mind racing. He was trapped between 2 points of attack. Eleonora, huddled by the bed, felt a terror so profound it was almost paralyzing. But then another feeling surged through her, a white-hot, defiant rage. These men, this Silas Croft, they were trying to destroy this home, to harm this man who, despite his harsh words, had protected her. She would not be a passive victim, cowering in a corner while he fought for her. She scrambled across the room, her eyes falling on the heavy, cast-iron skillet left on the washstand from that morning. It was heavy, solid. She grabbed it, her knuckles white. Just as she did, a dark shape appeared in her own window. A man was climbing through, a pistol in his hand. He hadn't expected to find anyone waiting. He saw her, a sneer twisting his lips. He never had a chance to raise his gun. With a cry born of fear and fury, Eleonora swung the skillet with all her might. The impact of iron against skull was a sickening thud. The man's eyes rolled back in his head, and he crumpled to the floor in a boneless heap, unconscious. Panting, she stared at the man on her floor, shocked at her own capacity for violence. The sound of another gunshot from the hall jolted her back to the present. Caleb was outnumbered. She remembered the spare rifle he kept in the tall wardrobe. He had shown her how to load it once, a casual lesson in self-sufficiency she had never expected to use. Her hands trembling, she pulled the heavy weapon from the wardrobe. She found the box of cartridges, her fingers clumsy as she fed them into the loading gate, just as he had shown her. She crept to her doorway, peering into the chaos of the main room. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness in strobing, terrifying bursts. Caleb was crouched behind the heavy dining table, which he had overturned for cover. Another man was firing at him from the cover of the front door frame. Eleonora knew she couldn't hit the man from her angle, but she could create a diversion. She saw a lantern sitting on a small table near the wall. It was her target. Taking a deep breath to steady herself, she raised a rifle, braced it against the door frame, and pulled the trigger. The kick of the rifle was a brutal shock, slamming into her shoulder, but the shot was true. The bullet shattered the lantern, sending glass and burning oil spraying across the wooden floor. A small fire ignited instantly, casting flickering, demonic shadows across the room. The gunman at the door swore and instinctively flinched away from the sudden flames, his attention diverted for a critical second. It was all the time Caleb needed. He rose from behind the table, fired twice, and the man at the door collapsed. But the fight wasn't over. From the shadows near the hearth, a large figure emerged. Silas Croft himself. He was a big man, his face contorted with rage. He had a revolver, and it was leveled directly at Caleb. "You should have just given her to me, Blackwood," he roared. Caleb's rifle was empty. He dropped it, his hand moving for the Colt at his hip, but he knew he was too slow. Time seemed to slow down. He saw the hammer of Croft's revolver pull back. "No!" Eleonora screamed. She didn't think. She acted. She grabbed the only other object of substance nearby, the heavy oil lamp from her bedside table, and hurled it with all her strength, not at Croft, but toward the open doorway that led to the barn. It crashed against the far wall, shattering and creating another splash of fire near a stack of dry burlap sacks. "Fire! The barn is on fire!" she shrieked, her voice high and panicked. It was a lie, but a believable one. For a single, fatal heartbeat, Croft's eyes flickered toward the new source of light and the sound of her scream, his mind processing the threat to his potential prize. In that instant of distraction, Caleb lunged. He didn't go for his gun. He closed the distance in 2 powerful strides, his body crashing into Croft's like a battering ram. The 2 men went down in a tangle of limbs. Croft's gun went off, the bullet burying itself harmlessly in the ceiling. Caleb's fist connected with Croft's jaw with a sickening crack. He hit him again, and again, all his fear and rage and terror for Eleonora fueling the blows. Croft went limp beneath him. Silence descended, broken only by the crackle of the small fires and the ragged gasps of their breathing. Caleb pushed himself off Croft's unconscious form, his knuckles bloody, his body screaming with exertion. His eyes immediately sought out Eleonora. She was standing in the doorway of her room, pale and trembling, the heavy rifle still clutched in her hands. He crossed the room to her in 3 strides, his heart hammering with a terror far greater than any he had felt during the fight. He reached her, his hands coming up to grip her shoulders, his eyes scanning her for any sign of injury. "Are you hurt? Did they hurt you?" he demanded, his voice thick with emotion. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I'm fine," seeing that she was truly unharmed, that she was alive and whole. The last of his carefully constructed walls shattered like glass against stone. The dam of 5 years of repressed grief and fear finally broke. All his coldness, all his attempts to push her away, vanished, consumed by the overwhelming, terrifying truth. He pulled her against him, his arms wrapping around her in a desperate, crushing embrace. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling her scent, grounding himself in the solid, living reality of her. "I was a fool," he choked out, his voice raw with a pain that had nothing to do with the fight. "A damned fool, sending you away. I thought I was protecting you, but I was protecting myself. I can't lose anyone else." He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. His slate eyes, no longer guarded, were shimmering with unshed tears. "The thought of you being gone is worse than any bullet. Solitude isn't a fortress, it's a prison. You walked in my life, Eleonora, and you brought the sun with you. I love you." The declaration, born from violence and the brink of loss, hung in the smoky air between them. It was the most honest, vulnerable, and beautiful thing she had ever heard. Tears streamed down her own face, tears of shock, of relief, of a joy so profound it was painful. She raised a trembling hand to his cheek. "Oh, Caleb," she breathed. And in the middle of the wreckage, surrounded by shattered glass and the smell of gunpowder, she leaned in and kissed him. The arrival of Sheriff Brody and a hastily assembled posse, drawn by the sound of the sustained gunfire, was almost an anticlimax. They found a scene of controlled chaos, small fires being stamped out by Martha, 2 men tied up with rope from the barn, Silas Croft, and another unconscious on the floor, and Caleb Blackwood, standing with his arm wrapped protectively around Eleanor Vance, neither of them willing to let the other go. Brody took in the scene with a grim satisfaction. "Looks like you handled Croft's eviction notice," he said dryly, gesturing for his men to haul the intruders away. His gaze softened as he looked at Caleb and Eleonora. He saw the way Caleb held her, the way she leaned into him. He saw that something fundamental had shifted. The solitary rancher was no longer alone. The following morning dawned clear and bright, washing the world clean. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, a stark contrast to the lingering scent of smoke in the house. The cleanup was a communal effort. Martha, clucking and complaining about the mess, directed the repairs with the authority of a general. Eleonora, her shoulder aching from the rifle's kick, worked alongside her, sweeping up glass and scrubbing powder burns from the floor. The shared labor was a balm, a way of physically mending the violation of their home. Caleb, after ensuring the prisoners were securely on their way to the jail in Cheyenne and giving his statement to Brody, sought Eleonora out. He found her by the creek that ran along the edge of his property, the same creek where his horses had nearly stampeded. She was sitting on a large, sun-warmed river stone, her face turned up to the morning light. The water chuckled over the rocks, a peaceful, timeless sound. He approached quietly, not wanting to startle her. She heard him anyway and turned, a small, soft smile touching her lips. The sight of it, after the terror of the night, made his heart ache with a fierce, protective tenderness. He sat on the stone beside her, the silence between them no longer tense or awkward, but comfortable, filled with everything that had been said and everything that was still to come. He took her hand, his calloused thumb tracing patterns over her knuckles. Her hand, though still soft, bore new scrapes and scratches from the night's work. It was the hand of a woman who was not afraid to fight for her home. "Last night," he began, his voice low, "when I saw you standing in that doorway, holding that rifle, I have never been so scared in my entire life. And I have never been more proud." He looked away from her, toward the running water, struggling with words that had been locked away for years. "For 5 years, I've been a ghost, walking through my own life, just existing. People looked at me, but they saw the grief. They saw the loss. They saw a man to be pitied or left alone." He turned back to her, his slate-gray eyes locking with hers. They were clear now, the shadows of the past receded, replaced by a raw, open adoration. "But you, from the very beginning, you saw something else. You saw a man. You challenged me. You pushed past the walls. You're the only person who ever looked at me like that," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Like I was still whole, Eleonora's heart swelled. This was the core of him, the truth he had hidden from the world and himself. She brought her other hand up to cup his jaw, her touch gentle. "That's because you were whole, Caleb. You were just wounded. There is a difference." He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing for a moment. He had planned this speech, but in her presence, the carefully chosen words felt inadequate. He reached into the small pocket of his waistcoat and pulled out a simple, thin gold band. It was worn with age, its shine muted to a soft glow. "This was my grandmother's," he said, his voice unsteady. "She gave it to my mother, who gave it to me for Mary." He paused, the memory a flicker of pain, but not the overwhelming agony it once was. It was just a part of his story now, not the end of it. "It represents my past," he continued, looking from the ring to her face. "All the love and all the loss that made me who I am. And I want it to be a part of our future." He held it out to her, his hand trembling slightly. "Eleonora Vance, you are the strongest, bravest, most astonishing woman I have ever known. You have made my house a home again. You have made me whole. Will you marry me?" Tears welled in her eyes, bright and shimmering in the morning sun. She thought of her arrival, a lost and frightened woman with a fraudulent letter and a hopeless future. She looked at the man before her, this solitary rancher who had offered her shelter, protected her with his life, and now was offering her his heart. This wild, beautiful land was no longer frightening. It was home. He was home. Yes, she whispered, her voice choked with happiness. Oh, Caleb. Yes, he slid the ring on her finger. It was a perfect fit. He leaned in and kissed her, not with the desperation of the night before, but with the deep, certain promise of a lifetime. The town of redemption, which had once seemed so judgmental, embraced their story. The tale of the brave Eastern lady and the reclusive rancher who had fought off Silas Croft gang became local legend. People who had once gossiped now tipped their hats in genuine respect. Neighbors rode out to help Caleb repair the damage to his house, bringing pies and offering labor, a quiet acceptance of Eleonora into their rugged community. Their wedding was a simple affair, held on the porch of the ranch house, officiated by Sheriff Brody. The whole town, it seemed, was in attendance, their presence a testament to the couple who had found love in the face of adversity. 2 years later, the Wyoming landscape was ablaze with the glory of autumn. The cottonwoods along the creek were a riot of brilliant gold, and the air was crisp with the promise of coming snow. The ranch had prospered. A new wing had been added to the log house, its fresh-cut timbers smelling of pine and promise. The fences were strong, the herd was healthy, and the silence that had once been Caleb's refuge was now filled with a different kind of peace. Eleonora sat in a sturdy rocking chair on the porch, a quilt tucked around her. Her form was soft and rounded, her belly swollen with the happy burden of their second child. At her feet, a little boy with a shock of dark hair and his mother's bright blue eyes toddled unsteadily, chasing a fallen leaf. They had named him Samuel, not to replace the child Caleb had lost, but to honor him, to bring the name back into the light of love and life. She watched as Caleb walked up from the barn, his long strides familiar and dear. The years had been kind to him. The deep lines of grief around his eyes had softened into laugh lines. The haunted look was gone, replaced by a quiet, profound contentment that radiated from him like warmth from a hearth. He was no longer the wounded loner, but a husband, a father, a man rooted deeply in the life he had built. He came up the porch steps and leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to her lips before placing a gentle hand on her belly, a gesture of reverence and love. He felt the faint flutter of life beneath his palm, and a smile touched his lips. He looked at his son, who had abandoned the leaf and was now trying to climb into his lap. He scooped the boy up, settling him onto his knee. Together, the three of them, soon to be four, looked out at their land. The sun was setting, painting the vast sky in hues of orange, pink, and deep violet. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying the scent of their home. This was their future, a tapestry woven from courage, resilience, and a love strong enough to redeem the deepest sorrows. Caleb looked at Eleonora, her face glowing in the twilight, and his heart was so full he felt it might burst. All the pain of his past had been a long, dark road leading him here to her. He had thought his life was over, but it had only been waiting to begin. She met his gaze, her blue eyes full of the same deep, knowing love. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she whispered, her hand covering his on her belly. He didn't look at the sunset. He looked at her. "Yes," he said, his voice full of a gratitude that would last a lifetime. "It is."